In all the conversations around childhood trauma, there is one form of trauma that is often neglected. Let's talk about it. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So, if you didn't pick up on it, today I want to talk about neglect. And I want to talk about this because I think kind of how I tend to talk about things and kind of what my channel is about. Neglect is often something that is overlooked or neglected in so many of not only the conversations that people have, but I think even in terms of our own experiences and the reality of what that means. So today's video isn't going to be going into all of the specifics of really what neglect is or isn't, though I will touch a little bit on that. I really want to talk about kind of the importance of being able to recognize, to accept the reality of the experience, if that's what you've experienced, and what it means for you and healing. So, neglect is something that I think a lot of people, even therapists, can have difficulty with really recognizing and acknowledging in terms of the depth of impact and what is required for healing. I know for me as an individual, as somebody who experienced neglect, as well as a couple of other types of abuse, it took me a long time to really fully accept the reality that the neglect had on my life. And that's because for us as humans, it's much easier to notice something being present versus the absence of something. And with neglect, it's about the absence of something. So when we think about sexual abuse, it's somebody perpetrating abuse. It's somebody doing something. Physical abuse, same thing. Psychological abuse or emotional abuse, same thing, even though it may not be physical in nature. It's somebody actually doing or saying something that is abusive, that leaves a lasting wound. When it comes to neglect, the wound actually comes from the absence of something, or often many things. As children, there is a lot that we need to experience in our lives to be able to really feel grounded and trusting of who we are, the world around us, our place in the world, the people around us, and what we can expect from them, ourselves, and the world. And so a lot of that can be connected to the experience of attachment as well. And I've talked a little bit about attachment issues for survivors of childhood trauma. But neglect is the absence of things that we need as children, as humans to a degree, but also particularly as children as we are developing, as we're developing our sense of self, our emotions, our stability in terms of emotional stability, and our capacity to be able to regulate and feel safe in the world. It's an absence of having our needs met. Now, sometimes it might be physical needs. So we may be lacking in having adequate housing or food, medical care, those types of things. Oftentimes, what we end up feeling or experiencing neglect in is emotional neglect. So certainly anybody who experiences physical neglect is also going to be experiencing emotional neglect. However, for many of the people watching this and others, physical neglect may be there to a degree, but oftentimes the physical neglect, like having our actual physical needs met, is not necessarily a problem. It's our emotional needs not being met. It's our ability to feel secure attachment that is not met. So one of the things that happens quite often is that people will talk about having like a good family, or they were provided for, they got to do things, they got to experience things, they never went hungry or anything like that. And so they feel like what they experienced wasn't bad because there's people that don't get to have those things, and so therefore their experience isn't as bad because those needs were met. And there hasn't been a ton of research done around emotional neglect. But years ago, I remember when I was really more into research, I wasn't doing my own research, I was just reading and learning a lot. I know that one of the reasons, or part of what was involved in trying to get complex PTSD into the DSM, was that there had been some research and recognizing that neglect could have as much of an impact as childhood sexual trauma. And part of that, and I've talked about this in other ways before, physical abuse can have just as much of an impact on somebody as sexual abuse. The difference is, or what can add to some of the layers for childhood sexual abuse, generally speaking, this will not be the case 100% of the time, but physical abuse, there's often signs. There's people that are aware that it's happening. There's often witnesses in some form, even if it's a sibling. So there's some different pieces there. When it comes to childhood sexual abuse, it's often done in complete secrecy. And even if somebody else thinks that they might know or has a suspicion, it's not quite as obvious. So within that sense of secrecy, there's a lot of isolation, and so it can add to some of those layers in regards to impact and sometimes healing as well. So with neglect, for the same reasons that childhood sexual abuse can create more layers, neglect can as well, and for additional reasons too. So when you have experienced neglect as a child, part of how you minimize it, because we all minimize our trauma experiences, but part of how you can minimize neglect is by telling yourself that your physical needs are met, if they are met, or even if they're not met, you'll find something that is met that you can point to and kind of try to forget about all the other ways they're not met. You can say to yourself, if you didn't experience physical abuse or sexual abuse or obvious emotional abuse, you can say to yourself, well, that didn't happen, so therefore it's not abuse. Because the absence of something doesn't seem like it can be categorized in the same way. But when we don't have our emotional or physical needs met, the impact that it can have is incredibly profound. Because when your needs are not met, you don't, particularly emotional needs, you don't ever get the opportunity to feel that sense of secure attachment, to feel grounded, to feel nourished in your being. You don't feel safe. You don't feel trusting in relationships because you have needs, even if you try to tell yourself that you don't, even if you make excuses and rationalize why you don't really need it or why that person can't do it and all of that. We still, especially as children, have a lot of emotional needs that are an important part of our psychological development. And I would say even not just psychological development, but our overall cognitive psychosocial development. So the impact is actually quite significant. So when you think about, if you've seen the video where I talked about attachment and how basically anybody who's experienced childhood trauma is going to have attachment issues, it's very much the same. I've talked about that, so you can watch some of that. But when your needs are not met, even when you're not aware that your needs are not met, in fact, sometimes, just like a lot of things I talk about, when you're not actually aware, it can often have more or deeper impact. So as a child, whether you're 2 months old, 2 years old, 8 years old, or even 15 years old. Now, obviously, the impact is going to be a little different on your developmental, depending on your developmental stage. So at 2 years old, it's going to be a little different than at 15. But all of those stages, there are a lot of things that are important for us to be able to experience that help us develop fully and maturely and safely into our adult lives. And when I say safely, I'm talking more specifically about our emotional sense of safety, that we're okay in the world, that the world is okay, and that if I screw something up, it's going to be okay. It doesn't mean that I'm unworthy, that sort of thing. So experiencing neglect as a child, particularly like if you're experiencing physical neglect, so if you're not getting the food that you need, if you're not getting the nourishment that you need from food, if you're feeling hungry, if you're feeling tired because you're not getting the kind of nutrition that you need, that is going to have an impact on you far beyond being hungry and not feeling well. Because if you aren't able to function as well, it's going to have an impact on your sense of self-worth and self-esteem, because you're going to be comparing yourself to siblings or classmates or that sort of thing, though your siblings are likely often going to be in a similar situation, though not always. I have worked, unfortunately, for many of them, I have worked with quite a few people over the years who have been treated very differently than some of their siblings. Now, that's not to say that their siblings maybe were not abused in other ways potentially, but I've worked with quite a few people where their experience was kind of singled out in a sense. And that's not horribly uncommon. And it can happen for different reasons. And sometimes one child is kind of the target of a particular type of thing. Another child might be a target of something else. But when it comes to not having those physical needs met, it basically teaches you, right? What is the message that you take from it? What do you interpret it to mean? What is the meaning that you attach to it? The meaning that you attach to being hungry all the time, or to feeling sick all the time and not having your needs met when you are sick. What you interpret that to mean is that you're not worthy, that you're a burden, that you're unlovable, that you don't matter. There's a lot of ways that you can interpret that. And so that obviously is going to create a belief within you. Now, if there's emotional neglect on top of that, and I have to say, physical neglect is also an aspect of emotional neglect. So if your physical needs are not being met, your medical needs, nutritional needs are not being met, there's an aspect of emotional neglect there as well. Now, emotional neglect can also look like, for example, if you have a parent or parents that have a lot of mental health issues, are really depressed or anxious, and or in a lot of grief, maybe have some other sort of mental health thing, have an addiction, just aren't really available, that is a form of neglect. Now, again, it can look quite different, but there is going to be an experience of neglect to some degree. And that can look quite different depending on some other circumstances in your life. Like you might have one parent that is pretty accessible on an emotional level, but maybe they're not really home that often. Or maybe they're really stressed out because the other parent isn't doing well and they're having a difficult time. So they may be more present, more available, but because they've got a lot of stress or whatever, they're not able to be there fully for you either. And of course, in a single parent family, when there's only one parent, if that parent is struggling, obviously it's going to be more challenging because there isn't another parent available that can kind of pick up the slack, so to speak. But if you have a parent who is struggling in any of those ways, there is likely going to be an aspect of emotional neglect. Now, one of the reasons that people often have a hard time calling it abuse or trauma is because they don't want to disparage their parent who neglected them. And this is true for other types of abuse as well, but it's really common in neglect because, again, it's the absence of something. And so it can be really challenging to basically hold a parent accountable for emotional neglect if there aren't other forms of neglect there. And that was one of the challenges I had because my mom wasn't physically abusive. She wasn't sexually abusive. She wasn't emotionally abusive really either, but there was definitely an aspect to that because of the neglect that was there. But my mom was also, I think, very clinically depressed really throughout my entire life. And my physical needs were not necessarily always met either. So with the emotional aspect of it, when we don't have our emotional needs met and we're not aware that our emotional needs have not been met, we then go through our lives, particularly if there aren't other forms of abuse, we go through our lives thinking that there's really no reason that you should struggle. Now, of course, people that have abuse in other forms will also believe that. But when you've experienced neglect in no other form of abuse, it's, I think, a little bit easier to hold on to that because it seems more real in a sense, because you don't have certain experiences that you can point to as specifically being abusive. So emotional neglect can look like a parent just emotionally not being available, just being really stressed out, just always being preoccupied with things, just not really being able to tend to your emotional well-being, not being able to be really emotional with you. So a lot of times, and this is often, I think, a form of wounding for that person as well, but parents who, they might be a pretty good parent really overall, but they don't really engage with their children. They don't engage on an emotional level with their children. They maybe don't allow their children to be emotional. They'll, tell them to not to cry, and you just got to pick yourself up, and they are well-meaning often when they do that, but basically there's no real space for deeper connection, for deeper vulnerable emotional intimacy. There's not a lot of sharing of feelings and emotions and affection and that sort of thing, even verbally. And before I forget, not having physical connection as a child, so not being hugged, not, having a parent put their arm around you, that is a form of physical neglect as well, because we need physical connection as humans, particularly as children. So when there's not a lot of kind of deeper, more real conversations in your family or with a parent, you're not having all of your, like the levels or the layers of your emotional development and needs. It's not being met. So in all reality, for anybody probably over the age of 30, and certainly I think to a large extent even children that are being born now, the way that we have evolved as a species, generally speaking, in most of the cultures that anybody watching this video likely lives in, grew up in, just historically, we as humans have not been good at allowing ourselves to be emotional, to allow our children to know how we're feeling, to really encourage children to explore their full range of emotions. I know for me as a parent, when my children were younger, and I think it's still probably the case, though this doesn't happen when I'm around my children a whole lot now that they're grown and out of the house, but when they were younger, I did not want them to see me upset, like sad. I really tried to hide it. In fact, when my mother died, they were like 5 and 6, I think. I actually did not want them to come to my mother's funeral. I wanted them to stay with my ex-mother-in-law. We lived near each other, and they would go see her, and I wanted them to stay with her because I didn't want them to see me really upset. And I don't think I had even started community college yet at that point, so I hadn't done any healing yet. And they ended up coming. That's a whole other story. But I was really not happy that they were there because I did not want them to see me upset. And they did. And as time went on and I started healing, I was able to be more present emotionally. I wasn't as shut off. I was able to, certainly as time went on, help them explore their emotions more and that sort of thing. But early in their lives, there was a lot that I was not able to do because I was shut off myself. So all of that can have a significant impact. And what it does to us as individuals is it does cause us, to a degree, now there are a lot of factors that are going to go into create the degree to which we struggle with this, but all of us will struggle with feeling safe in feeling emotions, expressing emotions, in even understanding our own emotions when we have experienced emotional neglect. Now, we also, depending on other circumstances going on in our home and in our environment, it leads to some pretty significant core beliefs, like being unworthy, never being good enough, that sort of thing. And healing from neglect, both physical and emotional, can be really complex. All childhood trauma healing is incredibly complex. But again, when we're talking about the absence of something, it can be a little bit more challenging to be able to really feel that full acceptance of the reality of the impact. It can be more challenging to, in a sense, heal the wounds. Because like if you think about something that is active, like physical or sexual abuse, I'm a visual kind of person, and so like every time it happens, it's like creating a bigger wound, right? Like the wound is getting bigger and bigger. When we're talking about the absence of something, just as an individual, it can be harder to really see the reality that it is also creating a bigger and bigger wound. And so when you're healing, it feels almost a little bit more intangible because it's harder to identify what you're actually healing from. And I don't know if that fully makes sense or not. And it may not, especially if you're still kind of coming to terms with the reality of the neglect or haven't really been able to do a whole lot of healing there yet. And the other part of this is that so often when somebody is going to even therapy and they're working on healing from childhood trauma, the neglect aspect of it is often really overlooked. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to specifically be talking about neglect. Like, you don't have to continue to use that term. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time specifically on the neglect. Because again, if you've experienced any other sort of trauma, there's an aspect of it that is kind of interwoven there. But what will often happen is that, in a sense, the wound that the neglect creates can often be completely overlooked. And that's where it can be kind of difficult, and where people find that they can sometimes continue to struggle, even if they feel like they've done a lot of therapy or even with a great therapist. But if the wound has not been addressed from the neglect, then that wound is still going to be there. It's still going to impact you. And healing from neglect is not a whole separate type of thing that you have to do. As I said, it's interwoven. And so if you have any other sort of childhood trauma, as long as you're acknowledging that the neglect is there and what that means for you, and even to a degree, like what that looked like in your life, then you're kind of healing all at once. If you haven't experienced other forms of trauma and you've experienced neglect, then what your focus is on more specifically is going to be neglect. But in a sense, that doesn't necessarily matter, because if you're in therapy and you're working on childhood trauma, then you probably already know that. So I hope that makes sense. So ultimately, what I kind of want people to take away from this, and I know that I have some therapists that watch this as well, is that being able to recognize, acknowledge, accept, honor, and heal neglect specifically is an important part of your healing, if that is what you've experienced. And again, if you've experienced any other sort of childhood trauma, particularly inside the home, there's a good chance that there's an aspect of neglect that's going to be important to acknowledge as well. And neglect can absolutely be there without other forms of trauma being there. And really importantly, neglect can be there even when your parent or parents really did try to do the best that they could. And what I mean, I don't think that parents, like, I don't call abusive parents, I would never suggest that they're doing the best that they could. Now, that's a whole other conversation. But parents, I think, can be incredibly neglectful without being like a bad parent. An abusive parent is a bad parent. Now, it doesn't mean that necessarily that they're a bad person, but they're certainly a bad parent. And again, that could be a whole other conversation. So if you have questions about that, let me know. But abuse is bad, right? Neglect is, in terms of the effect that it has on you, it is abuse. But a parent can be neglectful because they don't have the capacity to be everything that you need them, that you deserve for them to be. So I hope that makes sense. It doesn't let them off the hook anymore. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't make it less impactful. But there is a bit of a difference there. And sometimes, like, we can experience physical neglect without a parent specifically doing something wrong. For example, if you end up as a child homeless, your physical needs are likely not being fully met. Your emotional needs are likely not being fully met. Now, that is different, right, than a parent who is abusing you. Now, the impact that it can have on you can still be quite significant. Of course, there are a lot of other things that play into that as well. So again, I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions or need some clarification about that, let me know, and maybe I will do another video just to kind of bring this all together. But neglect is an important thing, especially when you have other forms of trauma, to acknowledge when you're working on healing. It's also incredibly important if you're not working on trauma to be able to recognize as well. And healing neglect can take a very long time, just as long as healing anything else. Particularly emotional neglect, depending on some other circumstances that might be present in that as well. So there really is a whole lot more that we could talk about here. So definitely let me know in the comments if you have any questions or would like me to expand on anything. And thank you so much for being here, and know that your experience, no matter what it is, it matters. And you deserve to heal. You deserve to feel the truth of your worthiness. Thanks so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you next time.